attention. I'll talk more about that in one of the use case examples. And then we had to integrate it with our security processes. You know, the things we do. Policy exceptions come in, right? As they always will. And the ability to analyze the risk associated with that and put that in the statement to management so they could make a decision as to whether to approve it and that sort of thing. And other examples, again, which we'll touch on in a minute. So those were some of the steps. Now, the use case examples I'm going to be sharing with you are the details have been changed to protect the innocent. All right, I can't share with you the details around them because they represent real risk for real companies. But I'll share enough and change the details enough that you'll get the gist and see how it was applied. So, in the beginning, we articulated risk in a very simple fashion for management when we first started using this. We essentially had a chart with two axes. You may have seen something similar to this where you have loss magnitude on one side and loss event frequency on the other, and the intersection is your risk point. Okay, and we used that at first, and it actually was very effective. And I'll show you one example of how we use that. Now we've evolved, and our analyses and the information we provide to management is a little different. And these are just some of the examples from one analysis we performed recently for somebody. But there are other ways of carving up the data. We can basically carve up our analyses in a whole lot of different ways and do all kinds of sensitivity testing and such that we weren't able to do originally. And again, if we had a lot more time, I could share some of that with you. But here's a simple example. There was a situation, one place, one client / employer, where we had identified a risk issue. And essentially, a rough approximation of the technology involved was we had a business partner connected to the internet, connected to our DMZ, connected to our core. Now, you look at that and you think, well, you have a DMZ, you have firewalls, that seems cool. Okay. Well, yes, it would be, except there was also some of our consumer information in the business partners' offices, in their network. All right, not a lot of it, but a little bit. All right, sensitive consumer information. Also, because of the nature in which they were connected to the DMZ, they were logically pretty much in the DMZ. So if you owned one of their workstations, you really were pretty much in the DMZ, and that first firewall was an expensive router. All right. Well, you're thinking, well, okay, but you still have a firewall between you and the core. Well, not really, because you're passing Microsoft protocols and some other protocols through there, so what you've got there is another really expensive router. All right? So you have essentially pass-through from the internet to the partner, to the DMZ, to the core. Now, there were some controls in place if it wasn't just wide open or anything like that, but there was still a significant amount of risk associated with this. Now, I managed to garner a grand total of 15 minutes with executive management on this issue. And the reason that was important was dealing with this was going to cost big bucks. Not only big bucks in terms of actual dollars and cents, but big bucks in terms of political capital in dealing with the partner, business partner. All right? It was not going to be a simple issue. And there was nobody under executive management that would begin to touch this as a result. So I weaseled 15 minutes with executive management. Now, as you might imagine, they don't have a lot of time to read stuff. I couldn't put together a 4-page or 6-page summary, all verbiage, and expect them to read it. I mean, if it was going to be more than a page, they weren't going to read it, pay any attention to it. Besides, it was relatively complex. What you're seeing here isn't so much, but the real scenario was more complex. And, you try to describe that in verbiage, it was problematic, all right? So what I did is I took a diagram, a single-page diagram similar to this, that had, this sort of illustration of the elements in play, and then I characterized risk at each level. I may need a new battery in my clicker here. Okay, so there's certain risk level because of the information in the business partner location, right? There's risk at the DMZ level, and there's risk at the core. Now the points here, point A in the, let's see if I can, my mouse is not going to show up. Point A, which you may or may not be able to see very clearly on the leftmost graph, it is the rightmost point on the leftmost graph or chart, is the current state. All right, high frequency, low impact, because there isn't a lot of data. There's some data, but not a lot of data. All right? If we applied a set of controls, we could drive that risk point to point B, reduce the frequency, and reduce impact a little bit. Okay? Now what's interesting in this is the risk in the DMZ zone. What you're seeing there is point A is current state. There's a higher concentration of assets there, so the loss magnitude is greater. Loss of end frequency is lower because there are some controls in place. But what's particularly interesting is point B. By applying the controls at the partner's location, you get a reduction in risk within the DMZ. No additional controls required within the DMZ. You apply the controls at the externalmost point and you get this downstream reduction in risk. When I start talking about that, their ears perked up. So we only have to apply controls in one place and we get reduction in risk elsewhere? I said, yeah. Same at the core. Again, huge, population of assets and high potential impact in the core, especially if a threat agent is going to make their way all the way to the core, they're probably up to no good in a serious way, and so the impact is likely to be much greater. But again, because there are some controls in place, the frequency around that is expected to be a lot less. But here again, by applying those controls at the periphery, we get a downstream reduction in risk at the core. So in 15 minutes, I took a diagram very much like this to management and had the commitment I needed to rectify the situation. So it was very effective as a communication tool. And again, it made sense to them. Another example. We had processes in place, and if you're familiar with best practices around processes, one of the things that they say organizations should have is integration into the system development lifecycle. All right? So security should be involved in technology projects, and business projects for that matter, from the word go, so that we can help them manage risk, right? So we're not an 11th hour obstacle when they want to throw the switch and put something into production. If we haven't been involved, there may be huge issues, and then all of a sudden we're a roadblock. And let me tell you, management doesn't like us as a roadblock. They don't like us at all as a roadblock. And 99 times out of 100 as a roadblock, you're a speed bump. They don't stop. They go ahead anyway. They've committed budget and time, and their bonuses may be on the line and so on. So they don't, essentially you're an annoyance. So it's very important to be engaged in these projects up front. All right, so we had that in place. And we had that in place for a couple of years. And so we'd been involved in projects from the get-go, identifying risk issues and using Lord knows what to estimate the risk around those. All right? Before we had this risk-based approach, each security analyst in the organization had their own judgment around what the risk was for each issue they ran into. All right? And so what we did as we looked at applying this is we took a snapshot of all the risk issues that had been identified over 2 years and how they'd been characterized from a high, medium, or low risk perspective. And this is roughly the percentage. About 40%, high 30s, around 40% of the issues had been identified as high risk. What's the problem with that? Well, inconsistency for one thing. One person's high risk is another person's medium risk and that sort of issue. But the other is you put enough high risk issues in front of someone, they begin to not care anymore. They become desensitized. Oh, another high risk Chicken Little issue. Where do I sign off on this? They don't pay attention to that anymore. All right? But the problem with that is buried somewhere in those high risk issues are issues that executive does not want their name next to. But they have no way of differentiating those. So I trained up my analysts and we began tracking the change. And we had roughly a 2/3, almost 3/4 reduction in high risk issues, which means management could focus on the